Some jobs wear you down slowly, so slowly that no one notices until something breaks. Day after day, he drove the same route, the same streets, the same porches, the same silence. People saw the packages, but not the man delivering them. Tonight, we open File 006, the delivery driver who never finished his last route. If you're enjoying this channel, consider leaving a like and subscribing. Your support helps this archive grow and ensures you never miss the next recovered file.
He stopped breathing correctly on a Tuesday. Nobody noticed. By Friday, he was gone. If you're enjoying this channel, consider leaving a like and subscribing. It truly helps this project grow. And at the end of this story, I'll reveal all the files connected to this case. His name was Dennis Holloway, and for 17 years he drove the same routes through Carver Falls, a town small enough that everyone recognized his truck, but not quite small enough that anyone really knew him. He was 43 years old. He lived alone in a rental house on Pinewood Court, with beige carpeting and a refrigerator that hummed too loud at night. Every morning at 5:15, his alarm pulled him from sleep that never felt complete, and he would sit on the edge of his bed in the dark, waiting for his body to remember how to stand. The work wasn't supposed to be permanent. That's what he told himself when he started. He'd been between things back then, between the life he thought he'd have and the one that was quietly taking shape around him. The job was just a bridge, a way to pay bills while he figured out what came next. But bridges have a way of becoming destinations when you stop looking up long enough to notice where you're standing. 17 years later, the uniform still felt temporary, but his body had begun to show the truth. His knees ached in the morning. His lower back seized when he bent to lift boxes. His hands had developed a tremor so faint that only he could see it, a small rebellion from muscles that had been asked to repeat the same motion tens of thousands of times. Carver Falls was the kind of place people moved to when they wanted life to slow down, when they wanted trees and quiet streets and the illusion of simplicity. It had 2 traffic lights, a main street with a hardware store and a diner that closed at 7, and rows of suburban neighborhoods where the houses all looked slightly different but felt exactly the same. People here ordered constantly. Dog food and diapers and birthday presents they didn't have time to shop for in person. Kitchen gadgets they'd seen in an ad at 2 in the morning. Books they'd never read. Supplements that promised energy, clarity, focus, relief. Everything delivered right to the door, as if the 30 seconds it took to receive a package could somehow fill the gap left by everything else they didn't have time for. Dennis knew the streets better than anyone. He knew which driveways had cracks deep enough to scrape the undercarriage of his truck. He knew which dogs barked but never bit, and which ones you had to watch. He knew the houses where someone was always home, usually sitting in a front room with the television on, waiting for a reason to get up. He knew the houses where no one answered even when the car was in the driveway, where the packages piled up on porches until someone finally brought them inside all at once, as if they'd been too tired to care until that moment. He knew which people said thank you and which ones snatched the box from his hands without looking at his face. He knew the elderly woman on Birch Street who always offered him water, and the man on Oakmont Drive who complained every time about boxes being left in the rain, even when it hadn't rained in weeks. He had become invisible in the way that familiar things do. Essential, but unnoticed. People depended on him the way they depended on streetlights or running water, something that worked so consistently they never had to think about it. And maybe that was fine. Maybe that was the trade. He delivered their lives to them in cardboard boxes, and in return, they let him pass through theirs without ever asking him to stop and explain who he was or why he looked so tired. But something had started to change. Not all at once. It was slow, the way rust spreads or paint fades. It started with small things he could ignore, forgetting which street came next even though he'd driven it 1,000 times. Losing his place on the manifest and having to scan the same box twice to make sure it was real. standing in front of a house with a package in his hands, staring at the door, and forgetting for just a moment why he was there. Little slips, little cracks. The kind of thing anyone might experience on a long day after a bad night's sleep, after too much coffee and not enough food. But it wasn't just one day. It was every day. And it was getting worse. He started feeling it in his chest first. A tightness that came and went, like something sitting on his lungs, pressing down just enough to make each breath feel deliberate. He told himself it was stress. The job had always been demanding, but lately the volume had increased. More packages, tighter delivery windows, new metrics that tracked every second of his route, every stop, every deviation. The company had started sending alerts to his handheld scanner whenever he fell behind, little messages that felt polite but carried the weight of a threat. He was being watched in ways that didn't require anyone to actually look at him, monitored by systems that measured his worth in minutes saved and packages moved. He stopped taking lunch breaks. There wasn't time. He ate protein bars while driving, drank gas station coffee that tasted like burnt plastic, kept moving because stopping meant falling further behind, and falling behind meant someone somewhere noticing that he wasn't keeping up anymore. The idea of being noticed, really noticed, of someone finally looking at him and deciding he wasn't good enough, terrified him more than he wanted to admit. So he kept going, faster, longer, skipping bathroom breaks until his bladder ached, ignoring the pain in his knees and the stiffness in his neck and the strange floating feeling that had started creeping into his vision during the last hour of every shift. At night, back at the rental house on Pinewood Court, he sat in the kitchen under the fluorescent light and ate meals that didn't taste like anything. Frozen dinners, canned soup, sometimes just crackers and peanut butter because the effort of cooking felt insurmountable. The television stayed on in the living room, voices filling the silence, but he wasn't really watching. He was thinking about the route, about which stops had taken too long, about the boxes he'd have to deliver tomorrow, about the scanner and the metrics and the way his supervisor's emails always seemed to arrive at the exact moment he sat down to rest, reminding him that there were standards to maintain, performance levels to uphold, goals to meet. He couldn't remember the last time someone had asked him how he was doing and actually waited for an answer. Couldn't remember the last conversation he'd had that wasn't transactional, an exchange of information or a response to a question about a package. He'd stopped calling his sister 3 years ago because every conversation had felt like an interrogation about why he was still doing this job, why he hadn't moved on, why he seemed so tired all the time. He didn't know how to explain that moving on required energy he didn't have, that the idea of starting over somewhere else felt like staring at a mountain he didn't have the strength to climb. So he'd just stopped calling, and she'd stopped calling back. The loneliness wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It was more like a slow evaporation, the gradual disappearance of connections, until he looked around one day and realized there was nothing left to hold on to. Just the route. Just the packages. Just the scanner beeping in his hand and the truck engine rumbling beneath him and the endless repetition of stopping and starting, lifting and walking, knocking and waiting and driving away before anyone had time to see his face. On the Tuesday when it started, the day he stopped breathing correctly, he was halfway through his route when the tightness in his chest became something more. Not pain exactly, more like pressure, like his ribs were closing in. He pulled over on a side street and sat in the truck with the engine running, trying to take a deep breath and finding that he couldn't. His lungs only filled halfway. The air felt thin, insufficient. He rolled down the window and gulped at the outside air, but it didn't help. His heart was beating too fast. His hands were shaking. The scanner on the passenger seat beeped, reminding him that he was behind schedule. He waited for the feeling to pass. It always passed. That's what he told himself. That's what he'd been telling himself for weeks now. Every time the tightness came back, every time his vision went a little gray around the edges, Every time his hands trembled so hard, he had to set down the box he was holding and breathe until the world stopped tilting. It always passed. And it did, this time too. After 5 minutes, maybe 10, the pressure eased. His heart slowed, his hands steadied. He picked up the scanner, checked the next address, and kept driving. But something inside him knew. Something he didn't have words for yet. Something that whispered in the back of his mind while he carried boxes up driveways and knocked on doors and smiled at strangers who barely glanced at him. Something that said this wasn't stress or exhaustion or a bad week. Something that said his body was giving up, that it had been asked to do too much for too long, and that it was finally deciding it couldn't anymore. He didn't tell anyone. There was no one to tell. And even if there was, what would he say? That he felt like he was disappearing? That every breath felt harder than the last? That he was afraid if he stopped moving, even for a moment, he might not be able to start again? So he kept delivering. By Wednesday, he couldn't remember what day it was without checking his phone. Time had started folding in on itself, each day identical to the one before, until the whole week felt like a single endless shift interrupted by brief periods of unconsciousness that didn't qualify as sleep. He would wake up at 5:15, and for the first few seconds, lying there in the dark, he wouldn't know if it was Monday or Friday or something in between. The alarm would tell him it was morning, but his body felt like it had never stopped working, like he'd simply closed his eyes for a moment, and now it was time to open them again and continue. The pressure in his chest had become constant, not severe enough to stop him, but present enough that he was always aware of it. A weight that shifted when he moved, tightened when he climbed stairs, eased slightly when he sat still, but never disappeared completely. He'd started taking shallow breaths without realizing it, his body instinctively protecting itself from something it couldn't name. When he noticed himself doing it, he would try to breathe deeply, to fill his lungs all the way, but the attempt made him dizzy. So he went back to the shallow breathing and tried not to think about what it meant. The route that day took him through the East Side neighborhoods, streets lined with maple trees that were just beginning to turn, their leaves edged in yellow and rust. These were the nicer houses, the ones with 2-car garages and landscaped yards and decorative mailboxes. The people here ordered more than anywhere else in Carver Falls: organic groceries, specialty coffee, toys for children who already had too many. Furniture that would be returned within a week because it didn't match the photos online. Dennis wondered sometimes what it was like to live in these houses, to have enough money and time that the primary concern of your day was whether a package arrived on schedule. He wondered if they were happy, if all the things they ordered filled whatever empty spaces they were trying to furnish. He pulled up to a house on Meadowbrook Drive, a 2-story colonial with white siding and black shutters and a wreath on the front door, even though it was still early September. The package was heavy, marked fragile, something breakable wrapped in layers of protection so it could travel 1,000 miles and arrive intact. He lifted it carefully, feeling the strain in his lower back, and carried it up the driveway. The doorbell camera swiveled to follow him. He could see the little red light that meant someone was watching, somewhere from a phone or a computer, tracking his movements in real time. He set the package down gently, pressed the button on his scanner to confirm delivery, and walked back to the truck. No one came to the door. They never did when the camera was watching. Why bother opening the door when you could see everything you needed to see from wherever you were? He was just a figure on a screen, a uniform and a box, proof that the system worked, that you could want something and have it appear, as if by magic, without ever having to interact with another human being. He sat in the truck for a moment before starting the engine. His hands were shaking again. The tremor had gotten worse over the past few days, spreading from his fingers to his wrists, a constant fine vibration that made it hard to hold the scanner steady. He clenched his fists, released them, clenched them again. The shaking continued. He thought about the protein bar in his lunch bag, wondered if his blood sugar was low, wondered if that explained any of this. But he wasn't hungry. The idea of eating made his stomach turn. The scanner beeped. 14 more stops before lunch. 83 more stops after that. He put the truck in gear and kept moving. At the next house, a woman answered the door before he could set the package down. She was maybe 35, wearing yoga pants and an oversized sweatshirt, hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She smiled at him, the kind of smile people give to service workers, polite but distant, a gesture that acknowledged his presence without really seeing him. "Thanks so much," she said, taking the box from his hands. "No problem," Dennis said. His voice sounded strange to him, thin and far away. She was already closing the door before he finished speaking. He stood there for a moment, looking at the closed door, trying to remember what he'd been about to say, or if he'd been about to say anything at all. The thought dissolved before he could hold on to it. He walked back to the truck, checked the scanner, drove to the next address. The forgetting had become more frequent. Not just streets or house numbers, but words, thoughts. The thread of his own internal monologue would snap mid-sentence and he'd find himself standing somewhere, holding something, with no clear memory of how he'd gotten there or what he'd been thinking about. It felt like his mind was a radio losing signal, the broadcast cutting in and out, leaving gaps filled with static. He knew he should see a doctor. The knowledge sat in the back of his mind like a stone, heavy and unmovable. But seeing a doctor meant taking time off work, and taking time off meant falling behind, and falling behind meant drawing attention to himself in ways that might end with someone deciding he wasn't capable anymore. And if he wasn't capable of doing this, what else was there? This was what he knew. This was what he'd spent 17 years learning how to do. Without it, he was nothing. Just a tired man in his 40s with no particular skills and no one waiting for him at the end of the day. So he ignored it. Ignored the pressure in his chest and the shaking in his hands and the moments when the world tilted sideways and he had to grab onto something to keep from falling. Ignored the way his vision would blur at the edges, turning everything peripheral into watercolor smears. Ignored the metallic taste in his mouth that had started showing up in the afternoons like he'd been sucking on pennies. Ignored the voice in his head that kept whispering that something was very wrong, that his body was sending signals he needed to listen to, that continuing like this might mean not continuing at all. Thursday was worse. He woke up on the bathroom floor at 3 in the morning with no memory of how he'd gotten there. He'd gone to bed at 11. He remembered that much. But between then and now, there was nothing, just a blank space where time should have been. His face was pressed against the cold tile. His right arm was numb from being slept on. When he tried to stand, the room spun so violently he had to sit back down and wait for it to stabilize. He made it back to bed eventually, but he didn't sleep. He lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, feeling his heart beat irregularly in his chest, skipping beats and then racing to catch up. He thought about calling an ambulance. The thought appeared fully formed, urgent, and clear. But then he thought about the cost, the bills that would arrive weeks later, bills he couldn't afford on a delivery driver's salary with insurance that barely covered anything. He thought about the questions they'd ask, the tests they'd run, the way they'd look at him when they found out he'd been ignoring symptoms for weeks. He thought about missing work, about his supervisor's face when Dennis tried to explain that he needed time off because he'd been found unconscious on his bathroom floor. He thought about being replaced, and he thought about the alternative, which was doing nothing, which was getting up in 1 hour and 45 minutes when his alarm went off and putting on his uniform and driving his route like he did every day, hoping that whatever was happening inside him would hold together just a little bit longer. That's what he did. The Thursday route was the longest of the week, 137 stops spread across the entire town. He started on the west side, in the older neighborhoods where the houses were small and close together, and the packages were usually cheap electronics or bulk orders from discount websites. Moved through downtown, delivering to the insurance office and the real estate agency and the law firm that ordered printer paper in quantities that suggested they'd never heard of email. Worked his way into the industrial park, dropping boxes at warehouses and storage facilities where no one ever seemed to be working. Then back into the residential areas, the endless suburbs where every street looked like every other street, and the only way to tell them apart was by reading the signs. He was on Sycamore Lane, carrying a package to a house with a chain-link fence and a garden full of ceramic gnomes, when his legs stopped working correctly. Not all at once. Just a sudden weakness, like someone had reached inside and unplugged something essential. His knees buckled. He caught himself on the fence, the metal cold and rough under his palm, and stood there breathing hard, waiting for the strength to come back. It did, after a moment. But it felt borrowed now, like he was operating on reserves that were almost empty, running on fumes and willpower and nothing else. He delivered the package, got back in the truck, checked the scanner. 93 stops remaining. The day stretched out ahead of him like a tunnel with no end, and somewhere deep inside, in a place he was trying very hard not to look, Dennis Halloway understood that he might not make it to the other side. But he kept driving anyway, because stopping wasn't an option, because the scanner kept beeping and the addresses kept loading, and the world kept expecting him to show up, to keep moving, to keep delivering, no matter what it cost him. And the cost, he was beginning to realize, might be everything he had left. Friday morning arrived the way it always did, indifferent and inevitable. Dennis woke before his alarm, which had been happening more often lately. His body too exhausted to stay asleep, but too damaged to find rest. He lay in bed watching the numbers on his clock change, 5:03 becoming 5:04 becoming 5:05, each minute passing with the weight of an hour. When the alarm finally sounded at 5:15, he turned it off and continued lying there, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince his body that standing up was possible. The pressure in his chest had changed. It wasn't just tightness anymore. It was pain now, dull and persistent, radiating from the center of his sternum out toward his shoulders. His left arm felt heavy, almost numb, and there was a tingling in his fingers that wouldn't go away, no matter how much he flexed his hand. He knew what these symptoms meant. Everyone knew what these symptoms meant. But knowing and accepting were different things. And accepting meant acknowledging that his body had moved past the point of warnings and into the territory of consequences. He got up anyway, showered in water that felt too hot and then too cold, his internal thermostat malfunctioning along with everything else. Got dressed in his uniform, the same brown shirt and brown pants he'd worn thousands of times before, the fabric worn soft in places, the company logo on his chest faded from repeated washing. Made coffee he didn't drink. Stood in the kitchen as dawn broke outside his window, painting the sky in shades of gray and pale orange, and tried to remember why he was doing this. Tried to remember what he was working toward, what the point of any of it was supposed to be. The answer didn't come. Maybe there wasn't one. Maybe the point was just the continuation itself, the act of showing up and performing the role and pretending that all of it mattered until eventually you reached some finish line that kept moving further away every time you thought you were getting close. He drove to the distribution center in the pre-dawn dark, the roads empty except for other people whose jobs required them to be awake when the rest of the world was sleeping. The building was a flat concrete warehouse on the edge of town, surrounded by chain-link fence and security lights that turned everything the color of old teeth. Inside, the fluorescent lights were so bright they made his eyes hurt. The other drivers were already there, loading their trucks, checking manifests, moving with the mechanical efficiency of people who'd done this too many times to think about it anymore. Nobody spoke to him. He didn't speak to them. They existed in parallel, all of them performing the same function, interchangeable parts in a machine that would continue running whether any individual piece broke down or not. Someone would replace him. That was the thing he'd finally understood over the past few days. If he disappeared tomorrow, there would be a job posting by the end of the week, and someone else would be driving his route within a month, and none of the people who received packages would ever know the difference. The system didn't depend on him specifically. It just needed someone, anyone, to occupy the space he currently filled. His truck was already loaded when he arrived. 119 packages, boxes of various sizes, stacked according to the delivery algorithm, organized by address and optimized for efficiency. Every decision made by software that calculated the fastest route and the shortest distance and the most cost-effective path through the day. He didn't have to think about it. Just follow the scanner, go where it told him to go, do what it told him to do, until the list was empty and the day was over. He climbed into the driver's seat and sat there for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, feeling the pain in his chest pulse in time with his heartbeat. The morning air was cool, coming through the open window, carrying the smell of diesel and cardboard, and the industrial park emptiness of a place built for function rather than beauty. He thought about not starting the engine, thought about going home, crawling back into bed, calling someone to say he couldn't do this today. But who would he call? And what would happen after today? Would tomorrow be any different? Would his body suddenly heal itself if he gave it 24 hours of rest? Or would he just be postponing the inevitable, adding one more day to a life that already felt like it had gone on too long? He started the engine. The route began in the southern part of town, where new developments were sprawling across what used to be farmland. Cookie-cutter houses painted in approved shades of beige and gray, each one with a two-car garage and a small yard, and a sense of newness that would fade within 5 years into the same worn ordinariness as everywhere else. The people who lived here were young families mostly, couples with small children and dogs and SUVs parked in driveways. They ordered constantly. Diapers and baby formula and toys that claimed to be educational, cleaning supplies and paper towels and batteries and phone chargers. Everything delivered because who had time to shop when you were working 45 hours a week and trying to raise kids and maintain a house and still pretend you had some kind of life beyond survival? Dennis understood them better than they would ever know. The exhaustion. The sense of being trapped in a system that demanded everything and gave back just enough to keep you going, but never enough to let you rest. The quiet desperation of people who'd believed they were working towards something better and were slowly realizing that this was it, that the promise was a lie, that the dream they'd been sold was just another product designed to keep them consuming and producing and moving until they couldn't anymore. He parked in front of a house on Willow Creek Drive and picked up a package from the back of the truck. His hands were shaking so badly now that he almost dropped it. The box was light, probably clothing or something similar, but lifting it felt like lifting concrete. His arms had no strength left. His legs trembled as he walked up the driveway. The pain in his chest had spread to his jaw, a tightness that made it hard to swallow. His vision was starting to blur again, the edges going soft and dark. He set the package down on the porch, scanned it, turned to walk back to the truck and had to stop halfway because his legs wouldn't hold him. He leaned against the side of the truck, breathing in short gasps, waiting for the world to stop spinning. A woman jogging past with a stroller glanced at him and then looked away, that reflexive avoidance people had when they saw someone struggling in public, the desire not to get involved overriding any instinct toward compassion. He pulled himself back into the truck and sat there, head against the steering wheel, feeling his heart beat erratically in his chest. The scanner beeped. 106 stops remaining. The day wasn't even half over yet. He kept going because he didn't know what else to do. Because stopping meant acknowledging that something terrible was happening, and as long as he kept moving, he could pretend it wasn't. Each delivery became a negotiation with his body. Each step up a driveway was a victory and a defeat. Each package delivered was proof that he could still function and evidence that functioning was killing him. The afternoon blurred into a sequence of addresses and doors, and strangers who took boxes from his hands without looking at his face. He stopped trying to smile, stopped saying anything beyond the bare minimum required, just handed over packages and walked away. A ghost moving through the world, present but not really there, visible but not really seen. By 4 o'clock, he'd reached the industrial section of his route. The warehouses and storage facilities and small businesses clustered on the outskirts of town. These stops were usually easy. No stairs to climb, no doorbells to ring. Just boxes left at loading docks or front entrances, scanned and recorded and forgotten. He welcomed the simplicity. His body had nothing left to give. Every movement was pain. Every breath felt insufficient. The metallic taste in his mouth had become overwhelming, like his tongue was dissolving. He pulled up behind a warehouse on Industrial Drive, a long gray building with boarded-up windows and a parking lot full of weeds pushing through cracked asphalt. The business had closed months ago, but packages still arrived here sometimes, redirected from old addresses or sent by systems that hadn't updated their records. This one was marked for a company that didn't exist anymore. He was supposed to mark it as undeliverable and take it back to the distribution center, but that meant carrying it back to the truck and adding another task to the end of a day that already felt impossible. So he left it by the back door of the warehouse, in the space between the building and a dumpster, where it probably wouldn't be found for weeks or maybe ever. He scanned it as delivered and marked the address as complete. A small transgression. A tiny failure in a career built on doing exactly what he was told. It felt both shameful and liberating, this moment of choosing the easier path, of prioritizing his own survival over the rules he'd followed for 17 years. He walked back to the truck and realized he couldn't remember where he'd parked it. He was standing in a parking lot, looking at a truck that was obviously his, but his mind couldn't connect the object in front of him to the concept of what it was supposed to be. The disconnect lasted only a few seconds, but it terrified him in a way nothing else had. His brain was failing along with his body. The machine was shutting down piece by piece, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. 18 stops remaining. The scanner told him so. 18 more houses, 18 more packages. Then the day would be over and he could go home and lie down, and maybe tomorrow would be different. Maybe tomorrow he'd wake up and feel normal again. Maybe this was just a bad week, a rough patch, something temporary that would pass if he could just push through one more day. He didn't believe it, but he needed to believe it. So he held on to the lie and drove to the next address. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the residential streets, turning everything golden in that brief window before dusk, when the world looked almost beautiful. Dennis drove through it like he was underwater, everything distant and muffled and strange. He delivered packages to houses where lights were coming on inside, where families were gathering for dinner, where life was continuing in its ordinary way, completely unaware that someone was disappearing right in front of them. 17 stops, 16, 15. His body was negotiating with itself now, deciding which functions were essential and which could be abandoned. His vision had narrowed to a tunnel. His hearing was muffled. His limbs felt like they belonged to someone else. But he could still drive, still lift, still scan, still deliver. That was all that mattered. That was all he had left. The last package sat on the passenger seat beside him. A small box wrapped in brown paper, light enough that it barely registered weight when he picked it up. The address was on Maple Ridge Court, a quiet street on the north end of town where the houses were older, modest ranches built in the 70s with aluminum siding and single-car garages. He'd been to this street hundreds of times before. He knew it the way he knew all the streets in Carver Falls, with a familiarity so deep it had stopped requiring conscious thought. But now, driving toward it in the failing light, everything looked unfamiliar. The trees seemed taller than he remembered. The houses seemed closer together. The street signs swam in and out of focus, words he recognized but couldn't quite read. He drove slowly, much slower than usual, checking the scanner every few seconds to make sure he was going the right direction, that he hadn't somehow gotten lost in a town he'd navigated blind for 17 years. The pain in his chest had become something enormous, a presence that filled his entire awareness. It wasn't sharp. It was deep and crushing, like his rib cage was collapsing inward, like gravity had increased and his heart was being pressed flat under the weight. His left arm was completely numb now. His fingers wouldn't close properly. He held the steering wheel with his right hand, his left arm hanging useless at his side, and tried to focus on the road, on the address, on finishing this one last delivery so he could rest. The house appeared on his right, number 47, a small ranch with faded blue siding and a chain-link fence around the yard. A basketball hoop stood in the driveway, net torn and hanging. The grass needed cutting. There were no cars visible, no lights on inside. It looked empty, or close to empty, the kind of place where people lived but didn't really occupy, passing through on their way to somewhere else. Dennis pulled up to the curb and sat there for a moment, engine running, looking at the house. The scanner showed this as the final stop. After this, he could go home. After this, the day would be over. After this, he could stop pretending everything was fine and, maybe finally, admit that he needed help, that something was terribly wrong, that he couldn't keep doing this. He turned off the engine. The sudden silence was disorienting. He could hear his own breathing, shallow and rapid, and underneath it the irregular thump of his heart struggling to maintain a rhythm it had forgotten. He picked up the package with his right hand, opened the door, stepped out onto the pavement. His legs buckled immediately. He caught himself on the side of the truck, holding on while the world tilted and spun. The package fell from his hand and hit the ground. He stared at it lying there on the asphalt, trying to remember what he was supposed to do with it, why he was standing here, what any of this meant. The connections in his brain were breaking down, synapses misfiring, thoughts dissolving before they could complete themselves. He bent down to pick up the package, and the movement sent a bolt of pain through his chest so intense that he couldn't breathe at all. He straightened up, gasping, clutching at his sternum with his right hand as if he could hold his heart together through sheer force of will. The pain radiated outward, down his left arm, up into his jaw, across his back. It was everywhere at once. It was everything. He picked up the package, held it against his chest with his right arm, walked toward the house. Each step was a negotiation. Each step required him to convince his body that movement was still possible, that it could give him just a little more, just enough to make it to the door and back. 30 feet. That was all. 30 feet there and 30 feet back, and then he could rest. The driveway felt like it went on forever. His vision had narrowed to a pinpoint, everything peripheral going black, like he was looking through a telescope at the end of which sat a door he needed to reach. He heard nothing but his own heartbeat, erratic and desperate, a drum with a broken rhythm. His right leg dragged slightly. His left arm hung dead at his side. But he kept moving, because that's what he did, because that's all he'd ever done, because stopping now would mean admitting that 17 years of this had led to nothing but this moment. Alone on a stranger's driveway, dying by inches while the world continued on without noticing. He reached the door, set the package down on the concrete step. His hands were shaking so violently now that the box nearly toppled over. He steadied it, pulled out the scanner, aimed it at the barcode. His vision was too blurry to see if it registered. He pressed the button anyway, heard a beep that might have been confirmation or might have been something else entirely. Delivery complete. He stood there for a moment, swaying slightly, looking at the package sitting on the step. A small box containing something someone had ordered, something they wanted or needed or had convinced themselves they couldn't live without. It had traveled hundreds or thousands of miles to get here, had been sorted and loaded and transported through a system designed for maximum efficiency, Had passed through how many hands, how many trucks, how many warehouses? All so it could end up here, on this step, delivered by a man who was falling apart. And whoever lived here would come home eventually and find it waiting, would pick it up and carry it inside and open it and pull out whatever was inside, would use it or wear it or plug it in or throw it away, would never know who had brought it here, would never think about the person who'd stood on this step in the last light of day, barely able to stand, barely able to breathe, finishing one final task in a life built entirely from tasks. Dennis turned and started walking back to the truck. Made it halfway before his legs gave out completely. He didn't fall. He just sort of folded, his body deciding on its own that it was done, that it had carried him as far as it was going to. He ended up on his knees on the driveway, the scanner still clutched in his right hand, looking at his truck parked at the curb 15 feet away. The pain in his chest had stopped. That scared him more than anything else. The pain had been terrible, but it had been information, evidence that his body was still trying. The absence of pain felt like surrender, like his heart had decided the struggle wasn't worth it anymore. He tried to stand and couldn't, tried to call out for help and found he had no voice, looked toward the houses on either side, hoping someone would see him, hoping someone would notice a delivery driver kneeling in a driveway in the twilight and recognize that something was wrong. But the street was empty. The windows were dark. The world was occupied with its own concerns, and he had spent so long being invisible that visibility had become impossible. He crawled toward the truck, not walking, not standing, just moving forward on his hands and knees like a child, like something broken, dragging himself across the asphalt with what little strength remained. The scanner fell from his hand. He left it behind, reached the truck and pulled himself up using the door handle, his right arm shaking with the effort, his left arm useless, his legs barely holding his weight. He managed to open the door, managed to pull himself into the driver's seat, sat there breathing in short gasps, tasting metal and something bitter, feeling his heart flutter in his chest like a bird trapped in too small a cage. The keys were still in the ignition. He could drive home. He could start the engine and drive the 5 miles back to his house on Pinewood Court and make it inside and lie down and call for help. 5 miles. He'd driven 5 miles 1,000 times. He could do it one more time. He turned the key. The engine started. He put the truck in gear and pulled away from the curb, driving slowly, both hands on the wheel now, even though his left hand couldn't really grip, steering more through momentum than control. He made it to the end of the block. Turned left onto Oakmont Drive. The truck drifted toward the center line. He corrected it. Drifted again. Corrected again. He couldn't remember where he was going. The streets all looked the same, the houses blurred together. He knew he needed to get somewhere, but the destination had dissolved from his mind, leaving only the vague sense that movement was required, that stopping was dangerous, that he needed to keep going until something told him he could rest. He turned onto Industrial Drive without meaning to, some autopilot function in his brain steering him toward familiar territory when conscious navigation became impossible. The warehouses appeared in his headlights, dark shapes against a darkening sky. He drove past them slowly, the truck wandering across the empty street, until he reached the gray warehouse where he'd left the undeliverable package earlier that day. He pulled into the parking lot and drove around to the back of the building, to the space between the warehouse and the dumpster where weeds grew through the asphalt and no one ever came. He parked the truck carefully, pulling it straight against the building, aligning it perfectly the way he'd been trained to do, the way he'd done thousands of times before. Turned off the engine, set the parking brake. Sat in the silence, listening to the tick of the cooling engine and the ragged sound of his own breathing. The pain had come back, worse than before, a crushing weight that made his vision go gray. He couldn't feel his arms anymore, couldn't feel his legs. His body was shutting down, one system at a time, prioritizing and abandoning and making decisions he had no say in. He thought about opening the door and trying to walk, trying to find help, but the idea seemed impossible, ridiculous, something that belonged to a version of himself that had stopped existing sometime between the last delivery and now. He thought about the people who would wonder where he was. His supervisor eventually when the truck didn't come back. Maybe some customers whose packages hadn't arrived. But beyond that, was there anyone who would actually miss him? Anyone who would feel the absence of Dennis Holloway as anything more than a minor inconvenience? He couldn't think of anyone. And that seemed like the saddest thing of all. Not the dying, not the pain, but the realization that he'd spent 17 years moving through the world without leaving any mark on it, without connecting to anyone in a way that would survive his absence. He'd been useful. He'd been reliable. He'd been a function performed by a person. But he'd never been seen, never been known, never been anything more than the uniform and the truck and the packages he delivered. The darkness was closing in now, not the darkness of night, but something deeper, something final. He could feel it at the edges of his consciousness, could feel himself slipping away like water through fingers, could feel the borders between himself and everything else beginning to dissolve. His last thought, before thinking became impossible, was a strange one. He wondered if the person who ordered that last package would leave a review, would mark the delivery as successful, would rate him 5 stars for service that met expectations. He wondered if anyone would ever know that it cost him everything. They found the truck 3 days later. A warehouse worker cutting through the parking lot noticed it sitting there and called it in. The police came, opened the door, found Dennis Holloway in the driver's seat, eyes closed, body still, looking almost peaceful in the way that death can sometimes look peaceful when you don't know what led to it. The medical examiner would later determine that he died of a massive heart attack, the culmination of weeks or maybe months of untreated cardiac symptoms, stress and exhaustion, and the cumulative damage of a body pushed past its limits. There would be a brief investigation. Nothing suspicious. Just a man who'd worked himself to death in the most literal sense, who'd ignored every warning sign his body gave him because stopping felt more dangerous than continuing. The company sent flowers to the funeral. 7 people attended. His supervisor gave a brief speech about dedication and service. His sister cried and said she wished she'd called more often. A few of his fellow drivers showed up in their uniforms, standing in the back saying nothing, looking uncomfortable in the way people do when confronted with the possibility that what happened to him could happen to them. The route was reassigned within a week. A new driver took over, following the same streets, delivering to the same houses, scanning packages with the same handheld device that still had some of Dennis's roots saved in its memory. The system continued without interruption. The packages kept flowing. The customers kept ordering. Nothing changed except the name on the personnel file, and even that was temporary. One more piece of data that would eventually be archived and forgotten. In the end, Dennis Holloway disappeared the way he'd lived, quietly, without fuss. Noticed only in his absence when packages stopped arriving and someone had to figure out why. He'd spent 17 years being invisible, and death didn't change that. It just made the invisibility permanent. The last package he delivered, the small box he'd left on the step of the house on Maple Ridge Court, was picked up by its recipient the following morning. A woman who'd ordered a book she'd been meaning to read for months. She carried it inside without looking at it closely, set it on a table, didn't open it for 3 days. When she finally did, she skimmed the first chapter and decided it wasn't what she'd expected. She left it on the table for a few more weeks and then donated it to a thrift store, still unread. She never knew it was the last thing Dennis Holloway ever delivered. Never knew that a man had knelt on her driveway, unable to stand, finishing one final task before driving away to die. Never thought about the person who'd brought that package to her door. Why would she? That's not how the system works. The delivery is the end point. What happens before that? Who makes it happen? How much it costs them? None of that is visible. None of that is part of the transaction. And maybe that's the real tragedy. Not that Dennis Holloway died. People die every day. But that he died in service of a system that treated him as disposable, that extracted every ounce of value from his body and his time and his life, and gave back just enough to keep him coming back for more, but never enough to let him live. A system that made his labor invisible and his suffering irrelevant. A system that would continue running smoothly whether he lived or died, because the system never depended on him specifically. Just on someone being willing to do what he did, for as long as they could, until they couldn't anymore. There's a kind of violence in that. Not the dramatic kind that makes headlines, but a quiet, persistent, erosive kind of violence that wears people down slowly, that takes away their humanity piece by piece, until there's nothing left but the function they perform. Until they forget they were ever anything more than the role they played. Until they die in a parking lot behind a warehouse, alone, unseen, just another cost of keeping the packages moving. Dennis Holloway was 43 years old when he died. He'd spent 17 years delivering packages to people who never saw his face. In those 17 years, he'd driven over 600,000 miles, had delivered an estimated 473,000 packages, had knocked on roughly 360,000 doors, had said thank you and you're welcome and have a good day so many times the words had lost all meaning. And when he died, the system barely noticed. Because that's what happens when you build a world where people are just parts of machines. When one part breaks, you replace it and keep going. No one stops to ask what broke it. No one wonders if maybe the machine itself is the problem. The warehouse where Dennis parked his truck for the last time was demolished 6 months later. They built a new distribution center there, bigger and more efficient, with automated sorting systems and algorithms that could plan routes faster than any human dispatcher. The new facility could process 3 times as many packages in half the time. Progress, they called it. Efficiency. Innovation. Nobody mentioned Dennis Holloway at the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Nobody thought to put up a plaque or say a prayer or acknowledge that someone had died in that spot, giving everything he had in service of the very system they were celebrating. His name appears in the company's records as a former employee. 17 years of service, no disciplinary actions, no complaints, a model worker right up until the end. The kind of employee every company wants, reliable, uncomplaining, present until the moment he wasn't. And somewhere in America right now, there's another delivery driver following another route, carrying another load of packages to another set of doors. Maybe they're tired, maybe their chest hurts, maybe their hands shake when they think no one's looking. Maybe they're wondering how much longer they can keep doing this, how much more their body can take, whether anyone would notice if they disappeared. Maybe they're thinking about stopping, about asking for help, about admitting that something's wrong. Or maybe, like Dennis Holloway, they'll just keep driving, keep delivering, keep moving forward because that's what the scanner tells them to do, because stopping feels impossible, because the system demands it, and they don't know how to refuse. Keep moving until they can't anymore, until their last delivery is really their last, until someone finds them in a parking lot somewhere and the packages keep coming, and the world keeps turning and nothing changes except another name in a file somewhere. Another person who gave everything to a system that took it all and asked for more. That's the file. That's the story. That's what happened to Dennis Holloway, delivery driver, 43 years old, 17 years of service, found dead in his truck behind a warehouse on Industrial Drive in Carver Falls on a Friday evening in September. Nobody wrote about it in the papers. Nobody made a documentary. Nobody investigated why a healthy man in his 40s dropped dead doing a job that's supposed to be simple. Nobody asked if maybe we should look at how we treat the people who bring our conveniences to our doors. Nobody wondered if Dennis Holloway was alone in his suffering, or if there are thousands of others out there right now, driving the same routes, feeling the same pain, heading toward the same end. Nobody asked those questions because asking them would mean acknowledging something uncomfortable. That the system we've built, the one that brings us anything we want at the touch of a button, runs on human suffering we've chosen not to see. That our convenience comes at a cost paid by people like Dennis Holloway. That somewhere between ordering something and receiving it, a person is involved, and that person is exhausted and ignored and slowly disappearing, and we don't care because we don't have to. The packages keep coming. That's all that matters. If this story resonated with you, please support the channel by subscribing and tell me where you're watching from. Your comment helps decide which forgotten file we restore next.